Right. So one of the major components of our studio project is light, right, and sun. And so, and then in perspective, you know, it's this idea of the sort of atmospheric, the effect that you can do with light. And so I wanted to just sort of quickly show you some examples of this. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm recording this because Liz couldn't be here. So I'll be able to sort of put this up on YouTube for her and embed it into Canvas. As well, I'll put this PDF, I'll PDF this presentation for you guys. It might be sort of lower res, but it shouldn't be a big deal to sort of upload it for you if you want to look through it closer later, or look for a specific example that I showed or something like that, right? So you guys ready?
Yes.
Yeah, all right. So there's no shortage of examples when you just sort of, you know, Google architecture and light or something, right? And you get all kinds of crazy examples. A lot of different sort of photographs, but then also just like sort of study models, right? You know, like made out of paper or foam core or something like that, with light shine through them. And so you can begin to start to see a number of effects here, and we can talk about these. But I just, you know, I thought it'd be interesting. You know, it doesn't take much to sort of Google this stuff and start to find, go down the rabbit hole, so to say, of just, you know, an amazing amount of information. You know, each of these are different, right? And so, you know, like this sort of effect with light is much different than, let's say, this one, right? This is the Broad Museum in downtown LA, done by Dilys Cafidio. You know, this is all about adding diffuse light inside, to sort of supplement, augment, or even replace electric light when possible. Whereas this is not about sort of making a light and airy space. It's much more about creating sort of contrast, right? This sort of really bright spot and what otherwise feels like a very dark and heavy space, right? And so you can begin to sort of get a sense for, you know, just like any other sort of elements of architecture and design, right? We have materials and we have space and volume, we have surface, we have edge, right? Light is another one of those that, you know, light and color, I would add, actually. So anyway, let's talk about some specific examples. All right, so who wants to tell me what this one is?
The Pantheon?
Sure is. It's Pantheon in Rome, right? So this Roman temple to the gods, for the longest time, maybe it still is, I don't know, but for the longest time, it was the largest poured concrete dome known to humankind. Has this oculus to the sky right there at the top, letting in a beam of light. All right, so light and architecture. Let's talk about this today. You know, again, we have the Pantheon in Rome, very famous example. I don't know if you guys talked about this in history, because this is a sort of from the Romans, and I don't know if your history class really went that far, but it's a shame if it didn't. But here's, you know, basically the party of the Pantheon in section, right? So you have a portico or porch, basically, right? That's sort of a gabled temple front. And you pass through that and into basically a large rotunda dome space, right? What's interesting about this, it's a round central space, has a round oculus at the top, it's a dome, right? So you could actually fit a sphere in here if you wanted to. This is sort of a half sphere. These sort of patterning on the inside, right? The coffering was basically the bunch of stuff related to formwork that lightened up the concrete, but it also you know, sort of gave a sort of effect here, like material and I don't know how you'd say it, sort of a material ornamentation, right? So, you know, that's how they got this sort of two-way system of sort of concentric circles and arcs, right, going in two different directions. It's not like they were thinking about these as beams and vaults, but really as a sort of dome. And then they use the coffers here, right, as these sort of removable parts of the form, right, to sort of subtract material where it wasn't needed. And you can see people have done studies on, the alignment of this with the sun and sort of trying to figure out exactly, where light comes throughout the year. So here's just a few of the games you can begin to play with light, shadow, right? Contrast, it's one of them. We'll see some examples. A lot of our examples will sort of overlap a number of these. Contrast can try to provide more of a connection to nature and understanding of, whether it's a circadian rhythms, the sun, or yearly cycles. Atmospherics, right? You can create dark places, bright places, light places, or a combination thereof, right? Monumentality, right? So with, I would argue that volume alone doesn't make something monumental, right? But sort of interplay of light to sort of help express your intentions, right? And it goes along with maybe with volume, space, and materials. Right? Well, again, we'll talk more about this. And symbolism, of course. So we'll see some examples of that. And then ornament and effect, right? So bringing ornament, maybe it's color, maybe it's patterning, etc. So we'll start with some examples. This is Ronchamp, a chapel that Le Corbusier did sort of towards the end of his career. You can see that we're looking on the inside at this sort of thickened wall with these very specifically punched apertures, right? So sort of windows as apertures, really small sort of windows, using some stained glass in order to create this sort of interesting effect, right? Again, contrast, punctuating things with some bright, otherwise dark space, heavy space with light and color. Here's what it looks like from the, oh, sorry, that's so pixelated, yikes. But then on the inside, you can see, how these things sort of turn out, right? I mean, this wall is entirely born out of playing with light, right, and color, and then adding light as a sort of texture on the inside. Here's another example of a chapel, a very small chapel out in the middle of nowhere. This is by the architect Peter Zumthor. What you'll see is that this is actually just cast concrete. The inside is pretty interesting. You can see the texture here is by using the formwork. So the formwork on the inside of this, basically this hollow cavity was filled with logs that were all tied up, and so then you cast the concrete around those, and then you burn out the logs afterwards, after the concrete's cured, and you get these sort of really darkened, highly textured interior, right? And so, this is all about sort of creating texture. And then you can see up at the top, right? You can see these sort of log flutes, sort of fluted texture in the concrete. And then there's an aperture at the top letting light in. There's a few reveals from the side letting some light in key places. Here's an actual smooth piece of concrete, right? It's actually lifted up off the ground, if you can see there, right? So you start to play with the sort of heaviness and lightness of materials. Peter Zumthor is very good at using materials and light to create atmospherics, right? Here's another example from Peter Zumthor, the thermal baths, somewhere in Switzerland. I can't remember exactly where. So this is in the sort of hillside or mountainside. And so it, part of it's subterranean. And so the use of materials is this sort of strata, right? You can see the sort of horizontality of various stones sort of laid, in order to create this sort of strata and streak effect. But then the very, very, very subtle uses, sometimes subtle and sometimes contrasting uses of light, right? So the ceiling stops right here, and there's a gap, there's a reveal, right? That lets light in from the top and washes down this wall in several places, right? Or even is rendered as a sort of edge, almost as if we were drawing with a white sort of light pen, And so you can begin to see these games, right? Similar to some of the games you guys are playing with your planar compositions and you can do in your museum studies as you go from sort of dumb blocks to surface, right? You begin to look at the interplay between surfaces, right? Sometimes it's enough just to sort of end a surface right before it, a roof right before it meets a wall, right? So that you can put a sort of bright reveal in and let light wash across the wall in a painterly way, right? Or to provide streaks, or again to sort of think about the sort of effects that can happen here, right? You can see these ideas, right? Just a little bit of deviation. I mean, this is a great sort of example of, let's say, a rule for materials, right? You see the stone here, so you tell the stonemasons, like, hey, I don't want everything to be flush, but I want you to deviate in depth, right? Within a certain tolerance, right? So put a string on the outside, put a string on the inside. Now you can sort of go back and forth in between in this little zone, right? And it adds just a little more depth here, right? Sort of creates a sort of what do you call it? You sort of read this three-dimensionally because you have some top and bottom surfaces being illuminated, right? Sort of relief that otherwise would just be sort of smooth. So it's pretty interesting set of ideas here, all sort of coming together, right? So you can begin to see that, these sort of subterranean passages with thermal springs feeding pools and things like that, and saunas, light becomes a sort of wayfinding device that you follow along. It also becomes a way to, again, reveal details and materials, to talk about sort of being down, inside the earth, right? By sort of letting these, it's almost like that lava tube effect that we talked about the other day. Right, here's some more examples. Dark, heavy, subterranean passageways, punctuated with, let's say, a reveal here in the ceiling that lets light through, right? Or something here that lets, bounces light in down all the way to the floor, right? So you can reinforce perspective, you can reinforce height with some of these tricks. There's a Japanese architect named Tadao Ondo. This is the famous example of his called the Church of Light, right? So you can see symbolism and contrast here used and in a very effective way, rendering this sort of cross in this wall, right? He's a master at sort of looking at light, shadow, and he uses concrete. I mean, he has to be the most anal sort of architect when it comes to sort of concrete. Concrete surfaces are about as perfect as you can make concrete, but they're made to be almost like blank canvases to sort of paint with light on them, right? So you start to see windows that are all about creating this sort of patterning of bright spots along the wall, and then casting the resulting sort of glares and shadows on the alternating sort of corner, or to bring in light to wash across the wall, just expressing a beam that sort of spans between the ceiling and the wall, right? Creating a contrast backdrop behind statuary and things like that. See another example here. Again, sort of there's structure punching through a wall, right? It's kind of an interesting way of doing this. Right? But otherwise a very minimal sort of spatial proposition, right? It's deceptively simple, right? There's a lot of nuance going on here when it comes to what meets up and what doesn't, and how you let light in different places, right? Illuminating this front wall, for instance. More examples from today, Ondo. More, right? Similar games he's playing with lighting. You take something as awful and simple as a corridor and turn it into something absolutely spectacular, something that you would actually want to go see if this sort of phenomenon. Variety of spaces. Here again, you can see the joints in between the form boards. What are these circles? Let's just talk about some of this stuff since you haven't had C-Tech yet. These circles, these holes in the concrete in this pattern, what are those? Anybody know? Or anybody want to guess?
I'm guessing they were sticks.
So
Are they
we call them
iron
tie
rods?
rods.
Tie rods?
So if you think about this for just a moment, let me just pull up my cursor here. Here we go. And let's say we have some sort of wood plywood form, right? And so we put another one right here to sort of cast a wall in between, right? So we'd be pouring concrete down into this in between, right? So what you have to do every so often, because concrete's heavy, to keep these from bowing outwards, you basically use tie rods to sort of tie them together so that you maintain the planarity of your form boards, right? So then because you have to drop a bunch of concrete in here and you have to shake the crap out of it, right? The pucky out of it to get all the air bubbles out. Otherwise you get like all kinds of weird air pockets and holes in here, right? And so the result right here is once you snap those off and take off the nuts, right, you get these sort of indentations in this pattern, right? And so that's just a result. It's like a sort of expression of how the concrete is actually poured, right? You can see, again, the sort of module of the plywood, right, as these edges. Sometimes you can play around with that formwork. You'll see like board formed concrete where, instead of using like a flat sheet, like a homogeneous sort of plywood, they'll use a set of like maybe 2x4s or some other sort of part of lumber, and their variation in that start to create sort of vertical, horizontal striations in the concrete, or like the example we showed with Peter Zumthor, that small chapel that was burned out. Logs as the sort of formwork on the inside, right? Leaving that sort of fluting behind, right? So what you often find is that some of these materials are they have these sort of expressions left into them, based off of how they're made or formed on site. Anyway, thought I'd just bring that up since they kept popping up here. Just pull that up. Again, you can see light, right? You can see sort of a grid and a composition of where to make openings, right? Let's see if I can get this to, yeah, again, pulling that roof or ceiling back from the wall, just a smidge, right? So that light can actually wash down it, right? And it's not like you see the light source, right? And it's not like you're getting direct light, into the space. What it does is it sort of washes against the wall and then bounces into the space, right? It's kind of a really interesting way of thinking about this stuff. Thinking about, in this case, these sort of modular blocks as a screen, right? Monumentality, look at this large volume. There's a human figure, right? And then basically just some subtraction. Again, sort of thinking about contrast, scale. Another very famous architect, Stephen Hall, does a lot of things with light. And so what he does is he does a lot of things with the skin to try to make the skin translucent. So what that does is it lets it glow. So when you're on the inside, it looks like it's glowing during the daytime. When it's outside and the building's lit up, it looks like it's glowing from the outside, right? You can sort of see these things here. He uses a lot of translucent materials where he can, and still trying to maintain thermal properties in the meantime. He's also doesn't seem to be afraid at all to go into the ground. You'll see that in several of his museums. If you're looking at, let's say, the Nelson Atkins Museum edition that he did in Kansas City, Missouri, or this, I forget where this is at, but it's a relatively new visual arts center that he did. But you can see, again, a lot of the games that you get to play and that you sort of were looking at, or we were looking at last week, these planar compositions, right? Sort of ability to very, very carefully add shapes, openings, punch outs, or sliding planes past each other or away from each other in order to create openings and effects that begin to bring in light, sometimes in dramatic ways, right? And other times just sort of illuminate the space. More examples from Stephen Hall, right? Various examples, lots of different types of examples. He's been around for a while. He's done a lot of different types of projects. You can see in his office, they actually do a lot of models, study models, where they try to mock up and try to understand the lighting, right? So here's a really famous, it's called the St. Ignatius Chapel they did. This is just a model of it where they were looking at, basically putting in a opening behind, sort of putting a second sort of wall up here, right? So there's a space in between this wall and that wall, and then in the outer wall, adding a window with stained glass. And so now you start to have this sort of light source that sort of comes in from behind a second surface here. It's pretty interesting. You can see that they do a lot of models. This is just another model where they're sort of just mocking up. You put the lamp at the right spot at the right time to sort of mock up, where shadows and light would happen in the inside. Right? Another model, you can see the scaled figures here. Trying to figure out, are you letting any direct light to the ground? If not, perfect, right? In this case, trying to create some more and more diffuse daylight through these openings in the ceiling. You can see some of the results from some of these studies, right? There's that wall that we were talking about, St. Ignatius Chapel. Ugh, I can't talk. St. Ignatius, I don't know. Maybe I'm butchering that word. Yeah, I have a few resolution issues with some of these photos, so my apologies for that. Louis Kahn, right? So really famous modernist architect. I was really interested in, say, materials and place, right? So he did a number of projects all over the world, and each one is sort of unique. But here's another example of what I would say is just sort of deploying light, material, and volume, sort of monumental ways. This is a really famous government center in forget where it is, maybe Bangladesh, that he did. It's a huge complex, right? And you can see, that there's all these offices, but there's these sort of atrium spaces, atria, and where he's doing lots of interesting things with light, right? This is really also sort of blurry on my screen, so my apologies. This is the Salk Institute in La Jolla, California, just north of San Diego. If you're ever in the area, you can visit this. So the Salk Institute, concrete and teak wood, but again, it's this place for researchers. And what's interesting about it is how he's bringing light down, even down in through some of these light wells and things like that. This is right on the Pacific Ocean, so it's like on a cliff overlooking the ocean. This is, I believe, at Yale University Exeter Museum. Again, deciding where there's places where you can bring in light, and then making sure that no direct light gets the actual artwork down here. But then you can borrow it from the sides and some of the other gallery spaces, right? So again, creating a large vertical space that you can borrow light from, indirect light from the side later on, right? Sort of creating a sort of outdoor, or sorry, an indoor courtyard, right? Or a light well, right? Another Louis Kahn building in Dallas, the Kimball Art Museum, right? And you can see here, I'll show you, I'll just quickly draw the section of this for you guys, right? So this is basically, you see the roof does this, and these vaults have a skylight here, right? And then what he did is he added one of these sort of light scoop thingies, right? So that no direct light actually goes in, but it illuminates these vaults, right? And so you never get any direct light on the artwork, right? But what's interesting is as the clouds move across the sky and the sky illuminates or gets darker, right? The ceiling, I mean, this is concrete ceiling, but it almost looks like it sort of glows and then sort of fades and glows. It's a really interesting phenomenon. Louis Kahn is a very famous architect, and he had kind of a troubling personal life. One of his sons actually did a documentary called My Architect about Louis Kahn. And so if you ever have a chance to, well, it used to be on Netflix. I don't know if it still is, but if you get a chance to watch that, our library actually has that on DVD, but it's this son that never knew his dad, who was a really famous architect. And so he starts to document both his life, but then he tries to get to know him better by visiting all of the sort of these world famous, buildings that his dad did. Let's see here. More examples. Again, my apologies for the resolution on some of these, right? This sort of monumentality, looking at materials and light, right? And doing spectacular things with them, right? Thinking about volumes, right? Here we have a tall volume that we sort of wrap around. You can start to see circulation moving around this, right? Both horizontal, lateral, and vertical. You sort of see ramps and stairways, right? You start to see layering of space and surface. Alvar Aalto, another, since deceased, but another famous modernist that again was highly specific to place, right? So this is a really famous church he did. We brought in daylight from the outside, top lighting basically. So you can see it's actually fairly light, airy space, even though there are no windows along the sides, right? The way he did it, you can see here are these light scoops at the top. And so, bringing things in from the top and letting them sort of diffuse down, right? So again, he was really good at this stuff. And another modernist, Eero Saarinen. This is the MIT Chapel. This is just a masonry. It's a very simple sort of simple building, right? You have an oculus, right? It's not open air, but you bring in light from the top. It's basically just one big space wrapped around. You can see it from the outside. It's very simple. There's a moat around it with some water. You can see that the masonry doesn't quite go down to the ground. Right? And so from the top, right, the ceiling in some places pulls away from the wall to wash and top light the wall in some places. And in other places where that brick doesn't quite meet the ground, then let me just pull up my cursor here. Right, so if I think about ground, and then I have some water, and then I have a brick wall right here, right? Let's say this is water. If I get light rays, I can bounce them up and in and start to create a glow from the bottom and wash part of the walls. It works at different times of the day, right? So if you thought about this being the sort of ground outside, we cut a channel of water in there. Here's part of the wall. And here's part of that masonry wall. Yeah, interesting. Right, so there's lots of different games you can play. And again, they don't have to be super complicated, right? But it really involves sort of looking in section and plan at some of these planes that you're working with and starting to do interesting things with them. That's why I was hoping maybe, you could start to see some of these tricks. Oftentimes the best ones are simple moves that pay off in big ways, right? So I wouldn't try to be too cute here, right? But simply being clear about what your intentions are, and then we can start to use these perspectives to start to test, to see if you're actually getting those effects, right? We can turn on the sun, get into a dark space, pull that wall away or slide it just past each other, or make an opening right here or there, or lift this thing up, right? And then move the sun across the sky and sort of see what happens. Okay. And I would really, like for us to spend some time doing that. We have that luxury to do that in the morning class, sort of thinking about, it's not just like, okay, learning Photoshop and doing perspectives for the fun of it, right? But as you start to learn more, and you can start to deploy your skills on more and more sort of targeted sort of perspectives that really talk about, how I move in and through your building and what those effects are. So it's really sort of highlights its relationship with the solar cycles, right? With the sun, which is part of what we were, part of the requirements for the project. Okay. So I just thought I would maybe throw that out there. Again, I'm going to after this morning class, I'll upload the YouTube video, and I'll also upload this as a PDF, and that way you have it. I'm going to stop sharing for a moment. And I think I'll stop